All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the show, The Balanced World with Dave Dettman. Today's guest is my little brother, Sean Dettman again. Welcome back, buddy.
Good to see you, Dave. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate you being here. A couple things that I want to go over today is I just want to review our last session. We had a little hour-long podcast last week and want to review that. And then we're going to get into a couple other issues with the economy and the differences in the economic system and educational system between the United States and Europe. If you would, I want to review last week, and I'll be posting that interview along with this one here in the next few days. But if I can, I want to test myself on what we went over and see if I can remember exactly everything that you've got going over there in Jersey. You are the director of the Jersey International Center for Advanced Studies.
That's correct.
Right? And you are mainly into postgraduate research, focusing on island and island communities, right?
That is exactly right. JICAS is a postgraduate research center that focuses on islands and island communities. That's exactly right.
And you said you consider yourself a 20th century Anglo-American historian, and I'm going to ask you about that in just a second.
Okay.
We joked around a little bit. You said you have a 80-20 workload between teaching and administrative work and research, and that you have 5 different hats. I got a kick out of that one. You participate in archaeological digs, too, around the world, right?
Yep.
All having to do with island communities.
That's right.
And then we also talked about how, like, those digs and the new information that you get from those archaeological digs get put into the historical database around the world. And, you know, sometimes history even gets updated with that stuff, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, the archaeology stuff, I'm a bit of a tourist, I have to admit. I organize them as part of my 80% administrative position rather than my 20% research position.
Okay.
So I administer those archaeological digs, and I have a hand in organizing them and designing them. So we always seem to find ourselves in very nice islands across the world,
Right.
particularly in the Mediterranean, in the Channel, and in the Caribbean.
Is that by design?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to organize anything down like in the Falkland Islands or, Patagonia or Christian somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic that takes 3 days to get to. No, I'm definitely looking for something that's enjoyable for all. But yeah, no, it is seriousness. The digs are fantastic. They're really a joy to be a part of. They're fantastic to organize. They're fantastic to be around the people who are experts that are, have active research agendas in these fields, in these sites, and mapped against these global themes of islands and island communities.
Right.
So we do have a lot of fun. They're very popular, as you can imagine. We get a lot of students, a lot of interests who want to go to the Cyclades Islands in June and in the middle of the Aegean Sea.
Right. I bet you don't have to ask too hard for that, do you?
No, we're full by the end of January, beginning of February.
Matter of fact, so you do have to turn people away then, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or say we got enough from.
Yeah, I mean, the team, the site can only hold so many students, so many active participants. So we usually travel as a team of about 20, so 5 staff and 15 students. And yeah, so that it's a real pleasure, a real joy to be part of that archaeological research. But like I said, I'm a tourist. That's not my active research agenda. But I do try to pay attention and try to learn as much as I can on these digs.
Right. Well, is there anything that you can think of that we went over that I forgot to mention? Meaning, I think we started getting into at the end of it how the New Deal is the high water mark for the democratic process. So, I kind of want to get into that here in a second. But before we get to that, my next question is, if you would elaborate more on, how you consider yourself a 20th century Anglo-American historian.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a kind of transatlantic tradition.
Okay.
The special relationship that has emerges in the 20th century across the 2 world wars. But I think more than that, I look at Anglo-American themes, global trends, particularly with regards to democracy promotion and its relationship with power. And that, again, can be at a state level, but also at an industrial level. So if we think about looking at why did the Allies go to war in First World War and in the Second World War? There are many reasons to many different people, but one of those reasons to some people was to safeguard and even to promote democratic processes as a means of preventing another catastrophic event. So if you think about it in very easy terms, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points,
Okay.
those 14 points are effectively the democratization of Europe around popular sovereignty concepts that were championed largely by the Americans and the British with some French input. So that really is a really good way of thinking about it, right?
Right.
Wilson and the Americans, with the support of the British, believed that democracy was the counterbalance to the European empires crumbling at that point, and that it would step in and lead the way in terms of, this Western bloc that emerges. And we see the same thing happening in the Second World War. Again, why did the United States go to war? Again, this is a question many people ask, and there are many different questions or many different answers according to many different people. But there are some people that we decided to go to war in 1940, and we decided to aid Britain against the onslaught of Nazi forces and the threat of a cross-channel invasion to preserve democracy, to preserve those democratic forces that were operating in Western Europe, and to counterbalance the rise of fascism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really easy way of thinking of it, right? Democracy is at the heart of the American way of life, and those processes and those institutions were exported across the Atlantic to Europe for the benefit of a stable, peaceful, and secure continent, European continent.
Right. So you're really into peace in the world as much as I am too, then, aren't you?
Yes, I think that peace is not the basis of my understanding or research on democracy promotion. The basis of my understanding of democracy promotion is to create vehicles of agency. And those vehicles of agency really allow more people to be part of the decision-making process, to have more people have control over their everyday life, and to have more people protected through collectively funded mechanisms. And I think that that's where you can kind of start to think about democracy promotion and its relationship with power at a state level,
Right.
mapped against what we were talking about last week with the New Deal, right? That state intervention, that's power at a state level. But some could argue, and I would be one of those that argue, that it's state power for the benefit of providing a social safety net for the majority of everyday people. It wasn't perfect. It had a lot of problems, but the effort was there, right? The ethos was there. And for the first time, perhaps ever, right, a state power stepped in and said, we need to be the guarantee for a standard of living. Right.
All right.
So that's one way of looking at democracy promotion at a state level, but there's also mechanisms to create that agency at an industrial level.
Mhm.
Industrial democracy, the organization of labor into unions, for example.
Right.
Again,
Right.
that counterbalance to forces that are in play that look to disrupt any kind of access to the decision making by everyday people, or in this case, the workforce.
Right. Well, one of the things I'm so interested in what you're doing with history is that the whole idea of my balance the world focus is for what are we doing as a human race? I mean,
Yes.
what is our goal? What is our objective? With every politically, through government, everything. What are we goal? What are we shooting for? What are
Yeah.
we trying to do with our laws and our work and our societies and our economies? So with through history and how it gets applied to that is something that I'm very interested in. So let's talk more about what the New Deal, with here in America, and how that relates to helping establish a balance with our planet and helping everyone out have a better life.
Well, I think that we should start with what is or was the New Deal. I think there are aspects of it still in place, but most of it has fallen away or has been withdrawn and eroded out from within. So effectively, the New Deal is a series of pieces of legislation that were implemented across the first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency from 1933. And then, of course, again in the reelection campaign in 1936. And the high watermark of those first 4 years was the Social Security Act of 1935. So the combination of Roosevelt's first New Deal across his first 4 years with the victory of 32, and then, of course, the first 100 days in the first part of 1933, looked at how do we provide relief, recovery, and reform mapped against the catastrophic events of the financial collapse from 29 to 33.
The Great Depression.
Yeah, the Great Depression. Relief, recovery, reform. The 3 R's. Those are those are the absolute the three-legged stool, if you will, of the New Deal. And of course, relief is immediate relief for people who are hungry poor. Right? They have absolutely no means of security.
Right.
And it could be argued through no fault of their own. Relief for single mothers whose husbands abandoned them to raise X amount of kids in dire conditions. Those people deserve support.
Right.
Again, mapped against our own understanding of humanity. What is our purpose on this earth if we can't take care of each other?
That's right.
So the relief is that immediate relief. The recovery, of course, then how do we recover aspects of our economy, of our society, and Roosevelt being a man of faith, recover aspects of our Christian values as Americans, which included looking after each other.
Sure.
So I think that's kind of that recovery aspect should or could include aspects of Roosevelt's own worldview on those matters. But at the heart of recovery is, how do we recover the banking industry, particularly?
Right.
How do we recover
to get the country back on track? And
how do we recover the agricultural sector? Right? How do we recover other aspects of the economy and everyday American life? And then, of course, the other one is reform. How do we structure our institutions and our organizations to never let this happen again?
Right.
And that is through a heavy sense of regulation, which was epitomized, again, brought out in the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking. And this is a big part of the New Deal and the reform of that three-legged stool, the reform aspect. The implementation of the Glass-Steagall Act separates commercial banking from high street banking.
Right.
So we can't commercial banking from investment banking. So separating Main Street from Wall Street.
Right.
Commercial banking is, you go into to Main Street, you put your deposits or your paycheck, and that stays within the community, mortgages, etc. Where, of course, investment banking is Wall Street. And the process had been so eroded out and deregulated in the previous decades that Wall Street was taking deposits from Main Street and using that to fund risky ventures for speculative causes. And of course, that's really the real reason, in a nutshell, that's really the reason for the collapse. So to put that barrier between commercial banking and investment banking was a real success that lasted until the 70s, 80s, and then Clinton dismantled the rest of it, the last bit of it.
Right.
The Frank-Dodd Act is kind of, attempts to resurrect Glass-Steagall after the 2008 crisis.
Right.
But that's now been eroded out, and it was a feeble attempt to resurrect the Glass-Steagall in the first place.
Well, I think you and I are on the same page with, as far as needing the government intervention to keep things, level and fair. And, there's a lot of people that say the New Deal didn't really work very well and that World War II is the only thing that helped our economy out. And, I really believe that a lot of those things were great, that, in the New Deal and that were helping us out. So, if somebody was to say that to you, how would you respond to the New Deal, how effective the New Deal was?
Yes, I think that it was the commitment that is the main important part. Right? That's the main thing, really, with regards to the New Deal, is the commitment. For the first time, the government stepped in and provided a floor. Right? It didn't lower the ceiling. It didn't provide a ceiling. It established a floor and a basic standard of living that says
Right.
we are going to collectively fund these mechanisms to provide a sense of security for our most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was it's the commitment.
Yeah.
The mechanisms are here and there. You can fine tune them, you can refine them, you can throw them out if they're not working. But all of those things are a matter of priority, right? There's no biology in our economy.
You mean
There's,
the
yeah,
will to actually do this?
yes, exactly. It's the commitment.
Right.
It's not an economic imperative the way we run our economy. It's a choice.
Right.
It's a construct,
Right.
right? And I think that that's the starting point. If we can run it like this to make rich people richer, then we can run it like that to spread the wealth out more evenly. And that's
Right.
just that is an absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're going to get people who are much smarter than me to talk about the mechanisms and the machinery to actually undertake those processes, or what I should say is overturn decades, if not centuries, of those processes to head in a new direction. But
Right.
I think that that's the main thing that we can't lose sight on. Anybody that wants to detract or take away or hate on the New Deal is attacking it in very, very small and feeble ways.
Right.
The
Well, I
point
think
is that there's a commitment. There was a commitment there, and the priority was to think about the economy in new and meaningful ways.
one of the things I like to address about here in America is, like you say, the will of people to help. Now, here, and I want to lead into my question about the difference between how it works over there in England versus United States, where I believe here in the United States, a lot of the reasons why we have such a political fight between Republicans and Democrats and rich and poor also leads into the fact that we have so many different types of people here in America. We're the melting pot. And here in America, everybody hates each other, whether it be race or religion or anything else. That we have so many different types of people that a lot of times I really believe that our rich people in this country don't want to help the poor people. Either they don't like them, or they're not trying, or they don't want to. Whereas countries like England and people, other countries around the world, usually they're kind of the same people where they like each other more. So if you would explain some of the differences between what you've seen in England as far as how government helps people more versus how in America we struggle to get the government to help us.
Yes, you're absolutely right that in Europe the populations are much more homogenous in
Exactly.
ethnicity. Although that's changing. That's changing in the post-war era, and the processes of decolonization and those imperial legacies are certainly having an effect on the demographic makeup of European. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a large Caribbean population, a large Jamaican population in London and in the UK. And of course, that has everything to do with the legacies of empire.
Absolutely.
But no doubt, the populations in Europe, and particularly in Northern Europe, where you have the more wealthy and developed nations, the population is largely homogenous. Everybody looks the same in Sweden. Everybody looks the same in Norway.
That's exactly my point. Yep.
Yeah. And I think so. This is where we don't have the distractions of race that we perhaps do in the United States, but instead it boils down to class.
Sure. Rich and
That
poor.
seems,
And
yeah, exactly. That is the main aspects of division amongst European nations within the last 200, 250 years. It's class driven.
Sure.
And I think that if we were to look a little bit deeper in American society, beyond the polemics of race, and beyond those stoked fears by the socio-political and socio-economic elite, then it would also fall down to class. Class trumps race.
Right.
Class trumps race.
Sure.
Race falls away once everybody aligns their economic interests to other people who have similar economic standing. And in many ways, you could argue that that's the problem in America, is that the race tensions are stoked by the socioeconomic and socio-political elites to prevent the aligning of class structures.
Yeah. A lot of times it's just an excuse, a
Yeah.
political football. And
If you look at, let's say, for example, in the late 1950s and the 1960s, right, the fear is not race riots in Chicago. It's the fear of what was called the Rainbow Coalition. It was the fear of whites and blacks uniting over economic interests rather than race divisions. So you had poor whites and poor blacks coming together to meet their economic interests as a part of this Rainbow Coalition.
yeah. Yeah.
And that was subverted from within. The FBI and other socio-political and socio-economic elite organizations infiltrated that
Trying to bust it
for that
up.
purpose. Yeah, because they said,
constantly.
yeah. The whole thing, it's the same thing if you look at the historical record in the 90s and the fear of communism, right? We are scared of this Messiah figure. We are scared that there's going to be one individual to unite the underclasses, not the under race, not the under genders, the under classes, to rally around this one figure that would be able to lead to whole school implementation of rearranged and restructured class systems.
Yeah.
And so that's a distraction in the United States. Whereas they don't have that political tool in Europe as much as they do in the United States, and the long legacy of slavery and race divisions and race hatred.
Right.
So there's no doubt that it's easier to do that in the United States, backdated, of course, with their infatuation with capitalism. But in Europe, it's a little bit easier to detect, i.e., it's all about class. It's always been about class. If you think of it in a pre-war position, or even, early 19th century, the population is almost completely homogenized. You have a very small ethnically diverse population, less than 2%, 3% of the population in these European countries. So class is a more obvious vehicle to unite the underrepresented.
So you still get a lot of rich versus poor there in Europe too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The legacies of class discrepancies and class structures in Europe is much more in your face. And it's much more in your face because people have confronted them head on and found ways to deal with them productively.
Right.
Not always peacefully,
Right.
but productively.
Right.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you like about the England or European system of government versus United States? Like even the process, like the political process, or anything that you can think of that you like better since you've been over there.
I'll omit Britain from this immediate part of the talk and focus mainly on the developed countries of Northern Europe. And the term welfarist, right, or the welfare state,
right,
does not carry pejorative connotations in those countries.
What do you mean by pejorative?
Well, just, negative, in the since Reagan, And since the hatchet job that they took to the welfare state, or what we call the New Deal, or whatever you want to call it, the demonization of Cadillac welfare mamas, and the valorization of Wall Street hedge fund managers,
Right.
that dual process of the 1980s, and the demonization of the social safety net for the purpose of tearing it apart.
Right.
That position in the 1980s has left a legacy that we're all just welfare cheats in the United States. They're lazy,
Sure.
they're no good, they
Sure.
don't deserve our help. My tax-paying money wants to go to clean roads and national security. We don't want these people to sit on the dole and soak
Right.
up our taxpayers' money, despite the fact that you can spout endless amounts of statistics about the percentage of the national budget that actually goes to welfare programs,
Yeah.
and then the small percentage of the money that actually goes to these welfare programs, and they're 90% elderly and children,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. These
Especially when you
statistics are so.
especially when you compare it to corporate welfare too. I mean, some of the billions of dollars that are going to the rich companies and they're such hypocrites. They're like, you can't help but poor people get fed and have health care, but yeah, you can give billions to build some useless spaceship to get to Mars. It's
Or
wrong.
drop bombs on people. I
Yeah,
mean,
right. That
if we're
too.
being really cynical about it.
That's right. That's right.
The defense industry is by far the largest procurer of public funding.
Right. So
And
would
I'm
you
not
say?
saying sorry,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, so would you say England and Europe are definitely more socialist than capitalist in?
Yes, I think they're more welfarist, and I'll make the distinction here in a minute, because they're welfarist, and the term, like I said, the welfare state is not demonized but valorized in this kind of inverted position to the United States. If you go to Sweden or Norway, and I understand they have vast resources, mineral deposits, oil. Everybody receives, a dividend based on the oil export revenue in these countries. But America's rich too. Regardless of how much oil they got, they're not richer than the United States. So I get it. They have, a lot of resources and means of providing those social safety nets. I get it. They're developed countries, and that is absolutely true. But again, it goes back to the main point that we were talking about earlier, David. It's the commitment. They are committed to it. They see sense. They know that a better and well-educated society will be a more productive society. They know that a national health system will keep the working people of that country healthy and going to work. They understand the value of infrastructure as a means of not only getting those people to school, to their jobs, but then also moving goods and services amongst those roads for the purpose of exporting and importing, all which feeds back into their economic systems.
Yeah.
So they understand the value of growing and indeed strengthening those public services for long-term purposes.
Thank you. The word long term hits home with me, because that's the thing I can't stand about America. Is here in America with our capitalism, is everything's just such a big competition. It's you have to beat the other person, and whether it's rich people fighting each other and keeping up with the Joneses,
Yeah.
or just keeping everybody else down in poverty so you look better. We don't work together for the good of society. Everybody just wants to be the best, and then even these billionaires who already have a billionaire, they just want more to have more than the other billionaires.
And it's a vehicle to power once you get to a certain amount of cash.
Yeah.
Let's face it. Let's face it. And I think there's nothing wrong with capitalism per se. Okay, so before we kind of move into the socialism, the utopian aspects of it, and the reality of it,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with somebody working hard, making a lot of money, and living a nice and comfortable life.
That's right.
but pay your fair share of tax, right? And pay it forward, because you must always remember that nobody gets rich alone.
That's right. That's
It
right.
takes a community to make somebody wealthy.
Yeah.
It takes
And
a community.
that's right. And that's the balance that I'm always talking about, is that, like, say a guy starts a business, he deserves to be rich. He worked his
Great.
butt off, fine. But to me, once you get to a certain level, you're not making the money anymore. Your employees are. Your
Exactly.
employers are doing all the work for you.
Exactly.
So that's why I believe in financial glass ceiling somehow, with the
Absolutely.
progressive income tax, or, something has to be done.
I couldn't agree more with you, Dave. And that's the point, is that, all right, we're looking at, post-war figures, or something like, the CEO makes 35 to 45 times more than, the employee. Okay, getting a little bit high. That's fine. But now we're reaching, in some industries and some sectors,
250.
250,000 times more.
Yep.
We have to fix work.
Right.
Before we do anything in this country, we have to fix work.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is through legislation and regulation, unless you want to let the workforce organize themselves
That's
to
right.
provide the mechanisms to do it for the government.
That's why I'm so involved in politics now, because a long time ago I realized that you have to be involved with politics, because the only way to truly make change on a global or national level or big enough scale is through the lawmaking process, is through government. So when everybody gives me crap about, oh, I hate the government, yes, the government is bad, it's not good enough, but it's the only way we stand a chance against corporations. So the whole thing about private versus public here in America is that, yes, our government is corrupt and it's broken and it needs to be fixed, but people need to understand that that's the only way you can do it, is through government. Government is the referee, the umpire, the lunch aid on the playground to keep the bullies from picking on the weaker kids. And
That's exactly right. No, you're absolutely right. I think that that's true. And I think also we have to remember that, like I said before, there's no biology in how we organize anything. It's all constructed. And if you can construct it this way, you can construct it that way. It's just a matter of priority and commitment.
That's
That's
right.
it. That's it. There's no economic imperative in any of this. There's no economic imperative. It is a matter of political priority. And that's it.
Right. Let's take a quick break real quick. Take a pause, and I want to show this little video, and mainly, just to practice it, and then we can talk more about it afterwards.
Okay.
It's just a little YouTube video about the difference between capitalism and socialism. I like these drawing type videos just because, for me, they're educational, and it's kind of the level that I'm at as far as the videos I'm making with PowerPoint. Okay. Let me bring this back up here. All right, now the reason I showed that video is because I like the end of it where it talked about how there's a balance between the two. And so what I wanted to ask you is kind of a two-part question. How much socialism is in Great Britain or England versus capitalism? And how much is it a debate with you guys? Because I know here in America, it's a huge divider between Republicans and Democrats. So I'm just wondering, how much is that a political debate in over there in Europe and England?
Yeah. So, so how much socialism is in Great Britain?
Right.
That's a good question. It has significantly dropped in popularity and since the 1980s. Of course, the Thatcher and Reagan axis certainly demonized the socialist policies and tendencies that were very strong and very popular during what historians call the post-war consensus. Now that term, it's loaded. We won't even get into it. But generically speaking, from 1945 to 1975, there was a political consensus that indeed the government has a role to play in terms of regulating big business and taxing business for the purpose of expanded public services, like we talked about. And the video is pretty straightforward on that. I mean, there are some kind of questionable statements across that, but they reflect a broad understanding of what socialism is understood to be, not necessarily what it is, but what is understood to be. Those
It's
two
a
things
bigger
are
debate than 3 minutes.
yeah, exactly. The reality, the rhetoric and the reality are always different, and indeed, that's why we have programs like yours, Dave, to to discuss the nuances and try to think about it more closely.
Right.
So, how much socialism is in Britain? Again, in a post-Thatcher Britain, it is less. You still have, of course, the Labour Party, which was and has been deemed by historians then and now as the post 45 Labour Party is a socialist party. Again, we could get into that if you really wanted to in future broadcasts, but it was seen as a very much kind of a socialist party. And of course, as you remember, they were swept into victory after the Second World War, 6 weeks after the war ended, and Churchill was ousted.
Yeah.
And he would, and the conservatives, the Tory parties, were forced to take on and absorb some of those characteristics of socialism, i.e., expansion of public services under this post-war consensus.
They really used Churchill for the war, and then once the war was over, they're like, "Hey, we want an economic guy back. You're done."
Yeah, well, I mean, Churchill has his uses, but they're beyond rallying the cause to withstand the threat of a cross-channel invasion. There are few.
Right.
But let's face it, it's pretty good cause. So he gets his place. He gets his place.
Yep.
But so is there a lot of socialism again? So after Thatcher, and the rise of Tony Blair and the new Labour Party, you are certainly not going back to the nationalization of certain industries and sectors. So, for example, trains, utility companies. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when these companies would fail, they would be nationalized.
Right.
Because I don't know, most people think that, electricity is a public service. It is not a private commodity to be traded over the market.
Right.
That right there is the essence of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
In the first 30 years since the war, that was the popular public sentiment. Electricity is a public service, and therefore it should be operated in a nationalized way, of which the government has 51% control over the companies.
Right.
They sold it off in the 80s. Matt Thatcher sold off all of those nationalized industries through the process of privatization, right?
Really?
So yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, okay. So all of the nationalized industries and sectors of the post-war era were largely sold off, including the post office, which was sold off by David Cameron in the last 10, 15 years. So all of these things have been privatized. Now, the new Labour Party, with the rise of Blair in the mid to late 90s, did not revert back to the nationalization of those industries. They let it be. And of course, according to some people, that is the primary function of a socialist government, is to nationalize industry, particularly those that are questionably a public service.
There's a lot of them that need to be nationalized. Yeah, that's the thing that bothers me so much about America is so many people think that it's got to be one or the other, 100%, 0%, when we're already a balance between the two here in America. You got, I would say, 70% capitalism, 30% socialism. And you can always argue the percentages, but there's so many people that, are paranoid of, we want 100% socialism. It's like, no, you just have to find the right balance between the two.
Exactly. Government has no business selling you soap or automobiles or luxury items or consumer goods. The government has zero business selling you tennis shoes.
Right.
Absolutely zero. Luxury goods, consumer goods, commodify, sell through the market. No problem. But what is a public service? What is
Fire
a public
department,
service?
fire
Yeah.
department, things that benefit everybody.
But okay, so is your telephone, is that a fundamental human right to have a telephone? Is it fundamental human right to have heat in your house?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
And if the answer is yes to that question,
Mm-hmm.
then it probably should be regulated, if not nationalized,
Right.
through a strong legislative code.
That's right. That's right.
And so that's really the socialism dynamic in Britain. Nationalization, then privatization, and now it's this back and forth, which one's which.
What's your best guess as to the percentages over there in England and Britain? Meaning like 50-50, what would you say?
I don't know. I really don't know. Finger in the wind, top of the head. I think that the British people have a healthier, better, more acute understanding of what a public service is versus what a commodity is.
Right. Compared to America.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration. Is the mindset, the worldview. And that's largely formed over different experiences, of course, like everything,
Right.
every opinion is formed over lived experience. But I would say that, again, Britain has a much healthier relationship with government offering public services, particularly healthcare. I mean,
such a big one.
Yeah. Quite arguably, the NHS is Britain's greatest contribution to the history of mankind.
So how good is the healthcare over there then compared to America?
Well, it's more accessible. Of course, the Mayo Clinic is the best clinical cancer research patient, operation in the world. Of course, there's nowhere better in the world than the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. But can you go to there? Can I go there? Can everyday Americans go to that? No. I mean, if you're an oligarch in Russia or if you're an oil magnate in the Middle East, you can go to the.
They really do run off money, don't they?
Yeah.
If you can pay for it, then yeah.
So it's more about the money they spend per person. The United States spends about what, $4,500 per person on healthcare, and it doesn't even have a nationalized healthcare service.
Right.
Whereas Britain pays far less per person, and it is free upon use and collectively funded. I think we should move away. The video that you showed said that these services are free. They're not free. They're collectively funded.
Right.
They're collectively funded.
Yeah.
And so I think that's largely the difference. Of course, if you think about it, that kind of ebb and flow of what is socialism, what isn't socialism, how is it applied in Britain, versus the United States.
Right.
The one big thing that New Labor got back to in the 90s is education. They gave every single British school leaver a grant to attend university if they have obtained the right qualifications. And they provided a vehicle and a path for those who did not have the academic qualifications to either achieve them or obtain a vocational qualification in its stead.
Right. Nice segue, because that's the last thing I wanted to talk about was education. So let's move into that. I'd like to hear. We got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to hear a little bit about the differences between the educational system over there versus America. Mainly high school. I guess is more my focus, because to me, high school graduation is the starting line for life. We should be preparing kids for life up until high school graduation. Then after that, then hey, okay, you're more on your own after that. So elaborate a little bit on the educational system over there.
Well, the delivery system is fairly different from the United States, and I would say the U.S. education system is better in structure.
Okay.
And perhaps in funding, in delivery is what I would argue. So, in in the post-war era has largely followed a 3-tiered system. So you go to primary education, right? So you go to primary school, roughly what would be our equivalent of kindergarten through 6th grade.
Grade school, we call
Yep.
it grade school.
Grade
Yeah.
school. So it's roughly
Elementary.
the same. Yeah, elementary school.
School.
Yep,
Mhm.
roughly the same. Okay. And so then at that 11, 12-year-old position, place in your life, right? You would go on to a secondary school. And a secondary school is, again, in American terms, roughly 7th grade through your sophomore year in high school. And that is the end of statutory education in the United Kingdom. So in Great Britain, you are only required to go to education through 16. Those that then go on to do what they call A levels or T levels, which are vocationally focused,
Mhm.
2-year programs that would, again, traditionally reserved for the academic proficient or the higher socioeconomic elites. And you go and you do your A levels in academic facilitating subjects, math,
Mhm.
English, history, science, etc. And
Mhm.
then that would be as a kind of 2-year baccalaureate to prepare you for university.
Okay.
And largely that's the way it followed into the 90s when that new labor came in. There's one other aspect of the system that has a pretty bad legacy as far as I'm concerned here in Great Britain, is called the 10 plus. So when you are 10 years old and you're kind of at the end of what they call primary school, you would take an exam and you would be determined to follow an academic route or a vocational route based on that IQ test that you take at 10, 11 years old.
Really? You
They
start
call
getting
it,
funneled sooner then, huh?
yes, which is ridiculous.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
just ridiculous. I mean, again, it is a legacy that is largely a pre-war legacy, class-driven, and very, very functionalist in terms of the education system. That was largely eradicated in the post-war era, but there are still some schools that make judgments based on those exams, which are called CAT scores.
Mhm.
So when you're 10 and then you take them again when you're 13, 14, you have these CAT scores, which
Mm.
sometimes are requirements for entry into an academic path through high school.
Hmm.
So there's a little bit of that legacy, that drag that still exists here in Britain, and it has an effect on your ability to pursue academic subjects
Uh-huh.
versus vocational. And then, of course, that has a massive impact on your profession.
Yeah.
This was one of the things that the New Labor looked to undo in the mid 90s, and their massive focus and investment on education into education here in Britain, which I think is a fantastic commitment and
Yeah.
investment. And they really wanted to play less attention to the vocational versus academic route,
Mhm.
which of course made some more traditionally minded and conservative folk very upset.
Mhm.
Oh, it's grade inflation. Oh,
Mhm.
grade inflation. Oh, you get an A and you just get an A for putting your name on the top of the paper. These
Right,
types of
right.
things that, back when you had to earn your A levels and you only got to go to
Sure.
university, if you deserved it. And
Uh-huh.
that's true. I mean, up
Uh-huh.
until about the 90s, there's only 10% of the population in Britain went to university.
Right.
That to me is more of an indictment of the system rather than the population.
Yeah.
you
So
know,
how much
so
so
yeah.
how much guidance counseling is there in those up to secondary in those last 2 years of what you called, college prep?
Yeah, A levels, yeah.
Because college, guidance counseling is important to me, or a big topic for me, because it seems like that's where a lot of the funneling comes from, and the,
Mm.
oh, you're going to go to
Yes.
university and you're going to get a blue collar job, and
Yes.
that's a big issue here in America too. So I'm just wondering what that's like over there too.
They largely depend on IQ tests to settle it for them.
So it's just testing, huh?
Yep.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, like, again, the A levels, there are two schools of thought on this, and I'd be welcome, I'd be happy to know and welcome what your thoughts are on that. But for the facilitating subjects, right? So your math, your English, your biology, your chemistry, your history, et cetera, so the main kind of academic disciplines and subjects. In A levels, right, your last 2 years, what we would call your junior and senior year, are extremely intense. And about 75 to 80% of your overall grade in those academic facing facilitating subjects is locked up in 2 or 3 exams that you take at the very end.
So just building up to 2 important exams then, huh?
So if you're not feeling well on that day, tough luck. There is some coursework, and there are some subjects and topics that don't operate like that. So if you drama, art. My daughter, she take art A levels, and of course, art that's not an examined subject. But the vast majority of academic disciplines and subjects are examined, and the way that they do that is you sit in a hall. Again, if you have exam provisions, extra time, you get to use a keyboard because your writing is illegible, et cetera, et cetera. They have all these different exam provisions for you. But at the end of the day, you file into somewhere on that day. Every student in the nation that is taking, right, AQA, A-level history, will take that exam on that day and at that time.
Some test anxiety there, man. Sheesh.
Exactly. And those exam papers will be sent away to be externally marked, right? Mapped against a mark scheme or a grading criteria. They will use that in some type of metrics to create a curve, or what is called the goalposts, right? So between the grade boundaries is the official term. But if you have the grade boundary, right, let's just say 35 is a D, all the way up to 65 is an A. I don't know, just, somewhat arbitrarily. Those are the grade boundaries, right? And then if you fall within that, that's the grade that you get. So it doesn't matter if you take that A level in some, rural small community in Scotland, or at some high thriving, prestigious private school, public school in London.
That keeps it a little fair then.
So that's the argument, right? That is a bit fair, because if you think about it, again, no disrespect, but your senior year history class in some rural small community in Louisiana is probably not as intense as it is in some elite prep school in Boston.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
We have the SAT and the ACT. But of course, the flip side to that, right, is that these exams are culturally, genderly, and racially biased. I mean, the subjects you could take are, like Tudor England. I'm exaggerating for effect here.
Okay.
But largely, the resources that are mobilized and the topics that are offered are largely, and again, mapped against criteria established by conservative governments, that have to include elements of British identity, subjects that have British history, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. On the one hand, it's more standardized. So no matter where you are in the country, you can achieve. But on the other hand, there is no room for nuances, and there's no room for exceptions to the rule. And in many ways, that's what teaching is to understand your students, to be able to offer those nuances and indeed at times exceptions.
Well, it sounds like you got goods and bads to your system over there too, huh?
Yeah. But I mean, for the most part, people find tremendous value in education in Britain. For the most part, they are still of the opinion that education is the best way to, improve your socioeconomic status, right? That Socioeconomic upward mobility is best achieved through earned privilege, not unearned privilege. And
Right.
of course, the best way to earn your privilege is to go to school, get a good education, and reach your potential.
Yeah. Well, education is definitely one of my top 5 issues. Just not only for helping people out with getting a better job and a better life, but also for better citizens and a better society. So,
Yeah, for
well, let's
community purposes, absolutely.
yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap up there. We're out of time. We're at about an hour here, so it's amazing how fast an hour goes sometimes when you're in a good conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah,
So
I
we'll
could I
have
could talk
to.
another hour for
Yeah,
sure.
I know it, and that's why that's why we can always just do it again in a couple weeks or a month from now or something. So,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
all
I'm
right.
there.
Well, I appreciate you having being on again, and look forward to the next time we get to do it again.
Likewise. Thanks, Dave.
All right. Thanks, buddy. Have a good day.